Wow, it's so good to see so many people from so many different places. وشكرا للناس اللي عم بيجتمعوا معنا من العالم العربي. Um, my name is Ralph Haddad. I'm the coordinator of advocacy and research at Basmeh and Zeitooneh. Basmeh and Zeitooneh is based in Beirut. I, however, am based in Montreal on unceded indigenous territory. Some people are still entering, so for those who are still new, please send us your name, your organizational affiliation, and where you are calling in from in the chat. And again, it's great to see so many people from so many different places. We hope you find this webinar educational and useful for your purposes. Once again, welcome to the event. I'm just going to give a breakdown of the event and how it's going to go. The event's going to last around 1.5 hours in total. There will be a short break in between, so don't worry about that. And the event is hosted by the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition. If you don't know what the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition is, it's a coalition of 5 organizations, including Basmeh and Zeitooneh, ALEF, Act for Human Rights, which is based in Lebanon, PAX, which is based in the Netherlands, 1111, which is based in Belgium, and Upinion, which is also based in the Netherlands. All these organizations have a common theme of peacebuilding, humanitarian work with a human rights background, complemented with Upinion, which is more of a social enterprise and provides two-way communication with communities and helps us conduct research actually with our target communities in our locales. So in general, as a coalition, what we've been trying to do and what we've also tried to do in this report is provide longitudinal research and advocacy on protection and return issues facing Syrian refugees. We've also released several briefs and publications in the past year, but this event is mainly based to present our latest comprehensive report, which brings together various cycles of research, both from within Lebanon and within Syria, and which also outlines the main protection and return issues facing Syrians currently. This event is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube. If anyone has a problem with the fact that the event is being recorded, or if they'd like to make an intervention that they would not like to be recorded, please let us know. You also have the opportunity to listen in on the interpretation channel on Zoom from English to Arabic and Arabic to English as well. Our colleague Khalwa Sabali is offering that service for us today. Thank you very much, Khalwa, for being with us. We are also doing this to allow the Syrian panel that we have been in dialogue with for our research to watch this event, as well as allow them to ask questions to the panelists, to the audience during the event. As the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition, we really aim to foster this connection between the people who are mostly challenged with the situation and those who have decision-making power to actually do something about this. So this event will try to reflect that to the best of its abilities. وبدي ارجع اقول شكرا كثير للناس اللي عم يحضرونا من لبنان واذا من العالم العربي بالكامل. بليز اذا بدكم تسالونا اسئله بالكيو اند اي بالعربي فيكم تسالونا بالعربي وحنجرب نرد عليكم بالعربي قد ما فينا وفي لايف انتربريتيشن من الانجليزي للعربي كمان. So I'm going to quickly run through the program before we begin with our program of speakers. We're going to start by asking you a few questions on the Mentimeter, and we will get back to your answers later during this launch, around 30 minutes after we sort of give you access to the Mentimeter. So please make sure to put in your answers before the next 30 minutes. Similar questions were asked to our Syrian panel, actually, who was watching. Similar questions that are present on the Mentimeter. So in the end, we'll just see what the answers are and we'll just aim to sort of form discussion around that as well. After our interaction with the Mentimeter, we will be joined by Mariat Hayek, our colleague who works for Access Center for Human Rights, for a short keynote speech on the situations and ongoing problems facing Syrians in Lebanon. After that, the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition will present its key findings from the current report, as well as conclusions and different kinds of recommendations. After that, you will have the answer, you will have the chance to ask questions. You can also raise questions during the event in the Q&A option in the chat. And so at the end, we can address those questions that are in the Q&A. And there will be a set time for the Q&A portion after the event as well. At the same time, so simultaneously, a part of the panel of Syrian individuals that we have present today with us, we will have a dialogue with them, and they're also watching the event. So actually, you'll be able to ask them questions as well. So if you have any questions that are geared to Syrians specifically, to these individuals who are watching, who have helped us collect all this research from the field through Upinion, please feel free to ask them questions directly as well. And later on in the event, we'll get back to the answers you had questions for. And then we will wrap up. As I mentioned, this will all take around an hour and a half. So this is the link to the Mentimeter. There are 4 questions, and they're multiple choice questions that we hope you can answer now. This will take really less than 2 minutes, and it's a pretty fast process. You can also go to the link in the chat that I believe is present there already. We will wait a few minutes for people to sort of access the Mentimeter and go through the questions and answer them. Okay, thank you very much for anyone who's filled out the Mentimeter. If anyone hasn't yet, the link will stay in the chat for you to consult throughout this event. So please feel free to go back to the Mentimeter link whenever you can. So we can now move on to our keynote of the event, which will be presented by Marielle Hayek. Maria is our colleague who works at Access Center for Human Rights as a programs manager with specific experience in research and advocacy on violations of international human rights and also international humanitarian law in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Access Center for Human Rights is an association established in Lebanon and France, and works mainly on monitoring and documenting human rights violations against refugees and conducting research and advocacy campaigns on these issues as well. I will now open the floor to Marielle. Marielle, are you with us?
Yes, thank you, Rad, for this introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. So as Ralph mentioned, we're a human rights organization that monitors and documents human rights violations against Syrian refugees, and particularly in Lebanon. And through this work, we produce research and advocacy campaigns on the issues that we document. Most recently, we worked on a UPR submission for Syria regarding human rights violations that Syrian returnees endure once they returned to Syria. And we're currently working on the illegal migration routes going on from Lebanon to other countries. And through this different work, we've come to observe human rights violations that are still continuing to take place throughout Syria by all parties on the ground. And so while the violence has ceased technically in the majority of Syria, that does not mean that Syria is safe for returns. Because security issues, as we've come to realize through our documentation, continues to take place and is still very much present. So as ACHR, we've actually documented many cases of people that were tortured and detained once they were returned to Syria. And these cases of arbitrary arrest also included people that were activists or that were for the opposition, working for the opposition, or that people who were subjected to reconciliation agreements that they thought would, make them safe against arrests, but it didn't work. And people of draft age who had paid the exemption fee, thinking this will also mean that once they return, they will not be taken for forced conscription, but it also did not work. So these are people that thought they're taking the safe route before returning, and they were still subjected to arbitrary arrest. And other than arbitrary arrests, we've also observed and continue to observe cases of forced disappearance. Most recently in August of 2021, we documented a case of 2 individuals who were Syrian army deserters. They deserted the Syrian army on the same day, got on a boat to Cyprus, to migrate to Cyprus, were returned to Lebanon, subsequently deported from Lebanon to Syria. And after this deportation, they were handed over immediately to the Syrian authorities. And we still, to this day, do not know what happened to them, neither does their first-degree relatives, who have no idea about their whereabouts. So these types of violations, they've been taking place for decades, and they continue to take place to this day. And despite, the arbitrary arrest and the torture and the well-documented forced disappearance by many organizations, not just ACHR, despite all of these violations, Lebanese authorities continue to deport Syrian refugees. And as ACHR alone, we documented this year until November 21, so since January 21 until November 2021, we've documented at least 49 cases of deportation. 33 of these cases were people who were trying to migrate to Cyprus. And so this alone is a big number, but it's not, a full number. So this is the number that we personally, as ACHR, went through the documentation process with them. But surely the number in reality is much bigger, which is extremely worrying, especially because upon return, these individuals, many of them were either detained, given conscription orders, including minors who were given conscription orders, and some were given court orders for terrorism charges that were very vague, and the individuals that were given the court orders still do not understand really what the charges are, and in addition to the 2 cases of forced disappearance that I mentioned. And so while the situation in Syria, it can be so difficult for some people, to the point where many individuals have tried to remigrate to another country. This could either be them trying to return to Lebanon after their voluntary or forced return, or to irregularly migrate to a third country. And so we've also noticed this. This is why I say voluntary return, because we've also noticed that some people make the voluntary decision to return to Syria without having the full idea of what's really waiting for them there. And once they return, they go through a lot of difficulties, not just the human rights violations that I discussed, but it could also be no access to basic services, house completely destroyed, unable to return to their, city of origin, and many other difficulties, or even obtaining their documents. Situation in Syria is much more difficult than they had the opportunity or the information provided to them. So they make the not well-informed choice to return. And after they return, they realize just how bad it is. And many of them have tried to migrate to a third country. This could be either by trying to go from Syria to Turkey or to Iraq, or even to Libya, and then go to a European country from there. And obviously that route, with it being so, you have to go through several borders. You're not really doing it the regular or the legal way. It puts them at a very high risk of violations. And that could be obviously dangerous. But what's equally dangerous and not much talked about is the people that decide to return to Lebanon. Because once you're deported to Syria, you have an entry ban to Lebanon. And so these people, despite having the entry ban, and despite not being able to cross and the borders being closed, and being so difficult for them to return to Lebanon and having to live under the radar if they do, they still decide to go through that process, because to them, if you ask them, they would say that to them, and all of these difficulties were still not as bad as what they had to go through while in Syria. And so at ACHR, we documented, for example, a case of 6 individuals that after being returned to Syria, decided to re-enter Lebanon, despite having the entry ban, and now have to live through the difficult life of, always being under the radar. They cannot go through any checkpoints, they cannot work, they cannot access any services whatsoever, no livelihoods. But once we asked them, and they said that was still easier than what they had to go through while being in Syria. Other cases were, for example, an individual who was also deported to Syria, and after being deported there, he risked his life by going to Libya and trying to migrate to a European country. So it's not always that easy of them being able to return, and then, if they weren't detained, then that life is simple because they weren't detained or forcibly disappeared. Violations there are much broader than that. And, in the current multi-crisis we have in Lebanon, it's very difficult to for them to actually settle here, because Lebanese and refugees alike have very much difficulties accessing their basic needs. Many people are relying on that or assistance, whether Lebanese or Syrians. So refugees, in addition to the general difficulties in the country, they also have to suffer from restricted access to other basic services like education and healthcare and livelihoods, mainly due to legal limitations, not to even mention residency problems. So these living conditions and the protection issues in Lebanon could play as an indirect factor for them to return to Syria or to choose to return to Syria, despite all the dangers that might arise there because of the current situation in Lebanon. And so we really need to think about more durable solutions of how to provide Syrian refugees with the protection and the dignity and the basic needs that they need for them to be able to at least make informed decisions about returns. Because, you know, while Syria might be safe for some people to return to, obviously it's not safe to be considered as a international under the international standards for returns when it comes to safe and voluntary and informed and dignified returns. And in that case, thinking more of resettlement of Syrian refugees to third countries could be a better option to provide them with the protection, the social integration, and the livelihoods that are basic minimum rights. I think now the research report that my colleagues at RPW worked on, it does a great job at going deeper into covering these issues of returns. And so I think I will end my keynote here and pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marielle, for that great intervention. Marielle will be available for questions during the Q&A as well. So if you have any questions for her specifically, feel free to raise them during the Q&A portion at the end or in the Q&A option on Zoom at the moment. And as Marielle mentioned, some of the things that she touched on are also sort of guiding tenets of our own work. And so for this report and for our previous report, there are some main sort of guiding research questions that we employ in order to think of how to approach the research and how best to analyze the research. And so we ask ourselves, what are the current realities of return for Syrian returnees from Lebanon? And so we gauge different kinds of variables through that in order for us to sort of form a holistic view of the return area and return sort of locale in order to assess whether it is safe for return. And we also ask, you know, to what extent can current refugee returns from Lebanon really be considered truly safe, voluntary, informed, and dignified, according to those thresholds that Marielle also mentioned. Furthermore, we ask, what are the priority needs and concerns of Syrian refugee returnees from Lebanon? So what are their most immediate needs? We really try to understand, you know, if there's any gaps that are missing of things that they need, whether it's material or more abstract like psychosocial support. And finally, to what extent are the UNHCR protection thresholds and parameters, which are the guiding thresholds and parameters of our work, for refugee return to Syria really being met within Syria? And then what are the main gaps experienced by refugee returnees as a result of those not being met? Maybe next slide. And so for our current and previous sort of data collection, we have two different types of data that we combine. So the first type of data that we try to collect is the qualitative data that we collect from within Syria, which basically is comprised of interviews with Syrians who have returned to Syria. And we try to focus on returnees who had returned within 6 to 12 month periods, so new returnees to Syria from Lebanon. And we have collected this for this report in 2 rounds. The first round took place in March, and this was the 3rd round in total that we've done so far, but the first for this report. Around 119 people were interviewed in the field. And then we did a follow-up data collection for that in August, where around 135 people were interviewed for that, from which 110 are the same as round 3. So we followed up with 110 people that we had already talked to in March as well. And this is also to form a more longitudinal sort of long-term kind of view of how things have changed or have not changed. We complement this by doing quantitative data collection within Lebanon, and this is done through the help of the Upinion platform as well. So this comprises of digital conversations with Syrians, including Palestinians who resided in Syria who also came here as refugees, as well as Lebanese people from the host community residing in Lebanon. And so 5 conversations took place as a sort of part of this data collection. One conversation took place in October, November of last year of 2020, where around 237 people responded. Another one took place in late November 2020 with many more respondents, around 430. We did another follow-up in March of this year, coinciding with the round 3 of data collection. We had 571 people respond to that. And then we did one in July, one in September, which was the most recent one, with 600 and 400 respondents respectively. And so to present these findings to you, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, Lisa Marti and Pinar Okur. Lisa Marti is the current research officer at Basmeh and Zeitooneh, and has worked on various research projects with us, including analyzing the data that she will present to you today. Lisa has an educational background in power, participation, and social change, and will be presenting the findings alongside Pinar Okur, who is the Senior Humanitarian and Development Advisor at Upinion. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa first to present the data from Syria. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. So Pinar and I will now for the next about 15 minutes present our key findings. I will focus on the Syria data and Pinar will focus on the Lebanon data. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to already write them into the chat. We will have time afterwards in the Q&A to address them. So I think these statements we can see here, they already very well demonstrate our first point that actually returning to Syria is not safe yet. Many of our respondents stated that fears of security forces, of conscriptions to military, of arbitrary detentions or of remnants of war are still very much present in the country. And if people are stating that they do feel safe, it is mostly tied to a sense of community feeling, like that they're across like their family or among their family and their friends, rather than actually a physical sense of safety. Another factor that very much shows this, and yeah, please change the slide, thank you, that the current conditions are not in place yet for a safe return, is actually that 70% of the returnee respondents in Syria mentioned that they are either for themselves or for their relatives or friends are concerned to be forcibly conscripted into the Syrian Arab army. This also in 43% of the cases actually concerns cases of people that have already been conscripted before. Having like this, being at the risk of forced conscription has actually very huge impacts, not only on the concerned men in terms of restricted freedom of movement, but also it restricts them in access, for instance, to do a job and to create income for the family, which basically, again, also then diminishes the livelihood of all concerned families. This is shown by example by also one of the respondents that said the main barrier for a stable income in our family is that my siblings are incapable of crossing checkpoints and going to work because they're wanted for reserve service. But safety issues are not only a concern of men. 60% of the women returnee respondents mentioned that they don't feel safe moving during the night, mainly also due to fears such as being afraid of sexual and violence abuse, as one 31-year female respondent from Homs, for instance, very clearly said, like, I'm really concerned about sexual and violence abuse, especially in the dark, so I never go out after sunset. That, and I will now lead to the Lebanon data.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Yes, while the situation in Syria is definitely not safe, we cannot say that in Lebanon, our Syrian respondents are feeling any safer. In fact, 72% of the Syrian respondents in our panel, of whom also thank you for joining us now during this launch, have stated that fear of deportation was one of the top concerns. As you can see in the bar chart next to it, there are other concerns as well, but this one really pops out, as well as a very economical one, the financial concerns on meeting your basic needs for health, food and rent. However, despite this fear of deportation, only less than 1% of the Syrians are currently thinking of returning to Syria. So despite the fears, the situation in Syria is not making it any easier for them to reconsider returning. With that, we can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, a further condition for return would be that this return is done in a voluntary and informed way. So according, for instance, to UNHCR's handbook on voluntary repatriation, the issue of voluntariness is very much implied also that there is an absence of any like physical or psychological or material issues of pressures that actually push people to go back that are present in their hosting countries. However, as for instance, the quote on the left side shows very well, such pressures in Lebanon are very much present and pushes people back to go back to Syria. And at the same time as the quote on the right side shows, also informed decisions are not always able to be done, as this information might turn out different on the ground. So on the next slide, we see a bit more precisely that it is actually 72%, so the big majority of returning respondents in Syria, that reports that it is the difficulties of living in Lebanon that were the main reasons that pushed them to go back. And as Marielle already mentioned in her keynote, this includes the general deterioration of the situation in Lebanon, but also economic difficulties, increased racism and tensions, and security concerns within Lebanon. Further reasons that that people in our interviews mentions why they went back is in 25% of the cases, there are reasons that, for instance, there is an absence of war-related hostilities in the places where they live, or that they would have job opportunities in Syria. But in many cases, it was also negative pull factors. For instance, they had to go back to Syria because their family was sick and they needed to take care of them, or they feared of losing their property in Syria, and only if they would go back, they would be able to keep their property. And as well, our research showed that it is about 26% of returnees respondents that did not have enough access to information about the situation in Syria before they returned. This was mostly either the case because they had returned in a rush, or because the information, once they have been on the ground, was completely different from what they heard, what again the first quote very much showed. So I think the Lebanon data also shows this very well.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. It follows up on that, and that's 80% of the respondents in Lebanon reported that they are not able to cover their living costs. So this is Lebanese host communities. And also what is also important to note that the majority had not received any kind of assistance, humanitarian assistance, in January 2020. This has been followed up multiple times, and the last conversation about this was last July 2021. So there's still a majority who has not received that. When we do look more in depth into the results, we see that to a certain point, men had more access to aid than women, especially in rental assistance. This was twice as much as women, maybe perhaps because men are more involved in this than women. Also, as I already said, all respondents indicated that they were primarily in need of support to cover their basic necessities. So for both respondents, the Syrians and the Lebanese respondents, the greatest needs are being rent, food, and healthcare, access to medicine, as you can also see in the charts. Yes, with that, we can continue with the next slide. well, there's just the statement quote that also shows how the situation is perceived by Syrian respondents, and also the majority, almost all of them, 90% of Syrian respondents reported feeling increased tension within their communities. Only regarding the informed return decision, a quarter of the Syrian respondents stated that they have reliable information about their areas of origin in Syria. So the majority, 3/4 of the respondents do not have that, and they usually get this from their friends and families. Next slide.
Yes. So we have heard now, electricity cuts. So we have to broadcast from the dark. Luckily, we are in the mobile data. But yes, so the actually deteriorating situation in Lebanon, we just heard that pushed back returnees. We also looked at this, at the lively conditions actually that returnees had once they returned. So when Syrians from Lebanon returned to Syria, we assessed like what livelihood conditions they have, what access to services they have, like electricity, education, and health. And as this two quotes shows, in this case as well, the situation also inside Syria actually deteriorated. So we can go to the next slide, where we can see that actually it is only like 29% of the respondents inside Syria that were actually able to cover their basic household necessities and needs, which basically means everyone else was not able to do so. And again, as I said, like all these services were very either like limited to have because non-existent, non-affordable, or in very bad quality, which means, for instance, having electricity for like only like 30 minutes to 3 hours. In max, what we had as responses were up to 12 hours. And actually also access to water is very much bound to electricity, but also public education was very much rated as bad, especially also compared to how it was before 2011. And also access to health services, especially to psychosocial support, is very limited. So from the whole interviews we did, there was only one respondent that actually said she had access to psychosocial support. So when we asked them about their household priority, most frequently mentioned was actually improving all of these services, including also having a general better stability and security in the country. So one further aspect, so maybe on the next slide, what we've also seen that there has been violations of housing, land and property rights. Despite that, actually 74% of the houses of respondents have been damaged or robbed, and only a very small proportion of these houses actually have been able to be repaired so far. And many have not even been able to move into their houses yet because they are that destroyed, and they either like don't have the rights and access or financial means to move in. And as well as 25% of respondents reported that they are at risk of losing their current place of residency. This can be because of the governmental planning policies of and the compensation is not clear yet, and it's not clear what is actually happening to the housings, but also seizure of the house through the government, because every contract that has been done in that period that the government was not in power in certain regions are not actually accepted. I often also state that the previous owners are labeled as terrorists, but also like sudden raise of rent or eviction through the landlord or landlady can put people very much at risk of losing their houses. A further factor we looked at is actually how far people are monitored that are returning to Syria. and if UNHCR has access to them, and also if they would actually contact UNHCR, which I think these two quotes illustrate quite well how there is actually quite few people that would contact UNHCR in case of an issue. And I think on the next slide, we see that a little bit more clearer in numbers as well. There have been only 3% of respondents that had actually been followed up by UNHCR. In total, like 54% of the respondents have not been followed up at all. And the others that have been followed up have only mainly not been followed up for monitoring reasons, but more either from the government to question them, or from aid organizations, but not especially because of them being returnees, but just in the general situation. And as I mentioned before, like there would only be around 12% of the respondents that would actually contact UNHCR in case of an issue. And we hence conclude that there is actually like no system in place yet for that. UNHCR actually really systematically monitors what happens to people once they return. So we have actually very little knowledge what happens to people that return at the moment to Syria. Yeah. And I think our research only can give like a little glimpse into that, but we think there would be much like broader and more comprehensive monitoring needed. But we will come to this later.
I think we can also share maybe the link to our monitoring mechanism paper, which goes more into that.
Exactly. Yeah. So a further aspect we looked at, I mean, we have been all very much impacted by Corona for the last 2 years. In case of Syria and Upinion, we also go to Lebanon. This had very big impact, mainly actually on really aggravating the livelihood situation even more, as it is already the case through to like limited working hours, but also through the closure of many services, and also the closure of borders meant that actually it discouraged people from returning. Do you want to say something about?
Yeah,
Lebanon?
I think that's on the next slide. Yes. So very basically about the vaccination itself, still majority of the respondents in Lebanon indicated that they were not vaccinated against COVID. Among the Syrian respondents, this percentage was slightly higher, almost hitting 80%. But even though there's still 40% of the respondents who do not know where and how to get the vaccination, if we have them amongst in the live stream, maybe we can add some information on that, so you can take that with you immediately. The majority were aware where they could receive this information about the vaccination program, which is a good involvement. And that is very shortly on the COVID's impact.
Exactly. Last but not least, we would like to mention something about like durable prospects for Syrians, because basically the whole situation we've heard that is really bad or puts people into this limbo of having a very bad situation in Lebanon as well as in Syria, actually leads to that there is no durable prospects for people, which is indicated, for instance, as well in the fact that from the people that return to Syria, about 40% consider leaving Syria as soon as they can again. Many more stated that they would leave Syria as well, but they just don't know where to go or don't have the financial means to do so. And furthermore, 63% of the returning respondents in Syria knew someone that actually came to Syria or returned to Syria and then returned to Lebanon from Syria. So quite a lot of people know people that wouldn't stay for a longer time or settle down in Syria, despite having wanted this, but the situation is just not in case there yet, or the conditions are not in case there yet. And in this vein also, like the overwhelming majority of respondents said that their relatives that live abroad currently do not think about returning to Syria at all.
So if we continue with the Lebanon data about this, about the lack of durable prospects, we understood that there's this trend of returning back from Syria, and almost half of our respondents in Lebanon reported that they knew someone who had returned. And economic hardship in Syria, evasion of military service, and harassment by security officials were among the reasons for their return. And as we also see it coming in the questions, almost 60% of Syrian respondents in Lebanon would like to leave Lebanon and go to a third country. So we also have some questions about resettlement. Later, when we get to the Q&A parts, we hope to be able to come back to this topic. So here in the bar chart, in the pie chart, you see the plans of our respondents. Like I said, resettlement is high on their list, while there's also a lot of unknown, in limbo, what to do, not sure yet, and remaining in Lebanon or moving inside Lebanon are also amongst the options.
Yes, and I think like what needs to be said about like also the prospects. I mean, everyone that we actually interviewed inside Syria, they were already people that were able to re-enter Syria at the moment, and there is a big part of people that are actually not able at all at the moment to re-return because they are on wanted lists, or so I think this furthermore shows that even people that are possible to return to Syria, they don't see the prospects there and for the conditions to be safe to return. And I think this leads to the main findings that Peter will.
Yes, the main conclusions. Yes, we can be very brief about this, as I think the presentation went into detail, and it might not be new in that sense, but it's very important to highlight that the conditions in Syria are not conducive for a safe and dignified return. So while the deteriorating situation in Lebanon makes a voluntary informed return decision impossible, we cannot go and think that return is safe at this moment. Syrian refugees in Lebanon are stuck in limbo while conditions around them are worsening. There are no viable prospects of durable solutions. I hope that our data has been able to back this up with evidence from both inside and outside Lebanon. And what we also want to conclude with is that according to our data, according to our findings, we think that the UNHCR protection thresholds are not achieved, and that there's no structural measuring and reporting against them in place. So these are very bold statements that I want to conclude, and then I would like to give the floor to my colleague Nadine from ALEF, who will continue with the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Pinar, for these super important and very timely findings. And just to remind everyone that this event is being live streamed to a panel in Lebanon, to Syrians, to refugees. So they do have questions for us as well. And as Pinar mentioned, in case anyone is also like a service provider or is able to speak about specific kinds of service provision or access to different kinds of things for refugees, please make a note of that, and we can go back to that at the Q&A if anyone's interested in presenting that data. I'm going to move it over to Nadine now to present the concrete recommendations that came out of this data that Lisa and Pinar just presented. Nadine Krishnan is a project coordinator at ALEF, Act for Human Rights, based in Lebanon, and she focuses on refugee rights and protection, and is also a facilitator for the PASC network. So that's the Persons Affected by the Syrian Crisis Network, which does bring together over 24 local NGOs that all work on issues affecting refugees and vulnerable host communities. So I'll gladly hand it over to Nadine to present those recommendations for us.
Thanks for that, Ralph. So to start, we call on European and EU member states to continue implementing, sorry, I think we're not on the correct slide. the slide before, please. Anyways, okay. We call on European and EU states to continue implementing strategies to respond to the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, but to ensure that this falls within the framework of UNHCR's durable solutions. And we also call on EU states to ensure that we're maintaining that Syria is not yet safe for return. We've already seen some countries declaring that certain places are safe for return or increasingly normalizing relations with Syria. And this is problematic, seeing as based on the report that we just discussed with you, and also other reports that are showing that returnees to Syria are in many cases being detained, subjected to torture, conscription, or even disappeared. And so any arbitrary returns would be a violation of the principle of non-refoulement. We also call on states to increase safe routes to Europe, which also means holding accountable state agents that are violating human rights standards and violating the ability of displaced persons to seek asylum. So we call on states to uphold the right to seek asylum and put an end to any pushbacks and abuses that are placing displaced persons in life-risking situations between borders and at sea. We also call on the same from the government of Lebanon, which should uphold its obligations under international law and domestic law to ensure that they are assessing asylum cases on a case-by-case basis, giving it the proper weight that it's due under a competent and impartial court. Any blanket deportation policies, such as the MOSA-sponsored return plan, need to be cancelled and revisited with UNHCR and other protection sectors. We also call on the government of Lebanon to allow UNHCR to resume registering refugees and ensure that UNHCR staff are quickly and immediately informed of any detentions of refugees and ensuring that proper proceedings are being followed. No one could be deported without having legal representation. So looking at monitoring now, as my colleagues just discussed our monitoring paper, we're aware that there is currently no international monitoring mechanism to ensure that the conditions in Syria are being properly assessed and that this information is being relayed back to displaced persons so that they can actually make an informed decision about whether or not to return. So this needs to be remedied, and I think we've shared the RPW monitoring paper in the chat. If anyone has any more questions about that, we're happy to discuss with you. So yeah, ensuring that displaced persons have information about the locations they're returning to. As you just heard from Pinar and Lisa, a lot of people are returning unaware that that the situation in their local neighborhood is completely dangerous and that they are not able to return, that they might face conscription, that they might face different forms of persecution. So this has to be remedied. And finally, to talk about donors, our recommendations are to ensure that there is sufficient flexible multi-year funding to sustain the prolonged humanitarian efforts that need to take place, especially here in Lebanon, with regard to both refugees, migrants, and vulnerable host communities. We're aware that the crisis in Lebanon is only at its beginning. It's going to take quite a while to recover from what we're going through. So we need funding that is actually sustainable and long-term and actually reflects the severity of the situation. That means we need more funding. That means we need more multi-year and flexible funding for the situation. We also hope that donors will ensure that the full value of their funding is being received by the organizations they work with. That means ceasing to play this sort of exchange rate game with the central bank, which continuously are losing at, because the exchange rate is totally unreliable and has already put a wrench in a lot of humanitarian efforts, or at least decreased the ability of humanitarian organizations to adequately respond to the crisis. With regards to localization, this is extremely important. Local organizations are often from and for the communities that they serve. So they are very well versed in what their local communities need, what their beneficiaries need. They have localized expertise that can't be found elsewhere. So we need to continue to support these organizations and allow them to determine the types of programming that are best suited for their communities. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for presenting those really, really important recommendations. It's just good to remind ourselves that this data and these recommendations are not just ink on paper, so to say. They are really affecting people's lives in very concrete ways. And so, it's good for us to sort of, think about that data and conceptualize that data and these recommendations in that way. These are very urgent recommendations, and the situation is still urgent, even though it might not seem so. So we urge a great conversation and discussion in the Q&A after we come back from a 5-minute break. We will have that Q&A together with the Syrian panel that's watching us live on YouTube. So marhaba la jamia. This is also the moment we'll come back to the questions we asked you at the beginning on the Mentimeter. So after the break. The same questions, as a reminder, were asked to the panel a few days ago. We also already have some questions coming in from our Syrian viewers that are watching live on YouTube. If anyone who is an audience member has any sort of concrete answers to any of these questions that are coming in from that panel, I would love to ask you to just make a note of that, and we'll have some interjection during the Q&A after that. So we'll be taking a 5-minute break now, and we'll be coming back in 5 minutes. Thank you everyone for watching so far, and please stick around with us. Okay, thank you all very much for waiting around for us. We will be moving to the Q&A portion of the event, which we aim to sort of foster a conversation between us, the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition, you, the audience, as well as the people watching live stream, Syrian refugees currently in Lebanon as well. So I suppose we will be beginning with the results from the Mentimeter.
So it will be also new for me to see how the results are coming in. So the Syrian panelists who are now joining in, and also their peers have been answering these questions yesterday and today, and so you have indeed just been answering these Mentimeter. So we're now going to see if how we're thinking about these topics, about these issues, and if there is alignment or if we think differently. And I think that will be a good bottom to start the Q&A with. So the first question that you have all been answering is, what are the most pressing protection issues in Lebanon currently? And as we see, the risk of pressurized or premature return has been mentioned mostly by you, our audience joining in now, and followed by lack of access to basic services. If we compare this with the panel members, Syrian respondents who are now who have filled this in yesterday and today, we see that lack of aid and lack of safety and security has been on their top list of most pressing protection issues. So there we see some differences. It's not saying that risk of pressurized or premature return is any less important, but it comes as a third, and lack of access to basic services has been mentioned as the fifth option. I think if there is any need, we can share these slides also, or go back and forth to show the differences. But then if we think constructively, what do we think is a good solution to tackle the increased tensions? Then according to you, the Mentimeter people, increasing aid for both host and refugee communities has been mentioned most, followed by addressing discrimination and other protection issues like deportations with the Lebanese authorities. It's very closely followed actually also by raising awareness of refugee conditions among host communities and providing more cooperation between communities. Yes, these seem all very valuable. If you look at the answers coming in from our Syrian respondents, we see by far the most answered option is increased resettlement opportunities. I think this is, yeah, there's a clear difference in how this is being perceived as the solution in tackling tensions, and there's something to say for both. Yeah, we can continue, Rolf. Thank you. So then we had a slightly different question, which is very timely with what we're doing now and having, of course, more involvement. So the question was, to what extent, in your opinions, are the voices of Syria's displaced heard? And according to you, I think half of you say mostly to absolutely not, whereas other half is saying sometimes. It's not that there's only minority saying that it's happening all the time. And if we compare this with the answers from our Syrian panel members, we see a similar percentage. Half of the responses are mostly to absolutely not, and a quarter thinks it's sometimes, while most of the time or all the time is in the minority. Although, yeah, I mean, it's still around 10%, so that is that's hopeful. Let's hope this will only increase further. Then there was the question on how can we then improve and increase the involvement of Syrians displaced in these discussions. And according to those who answered through Mentimeter, it would be through Lebanese and Syrian civil society organizations, followed by involving people individually, like online platforms, through online platforms. And if we compare this with the answers from our Syrian guests, what do we see then? If we go to the next slide, through UNHCR has been answered by 65%, followed by involving people individually like myself through participation in online platforms. And then as a third option through Lebanese and Syrian CSOs, NGOs. These are also some differences in perceptions on this and how we can do this. I think this one has been already presented. Maybe we can also open up the discussion on this about the representation through NGOs. How do you feel? This is a question that has not been asked to the Mentimeter, and has not been asked in Mentimeter, but we have asked this additionally to our Syrian respondents, to a kind of sense how they are feeling about the current policies on return to Syria and the normalization of relations between some countries and the Syrian government. And 60% have said, I have a fear of being detained in Syria if I return. This is a very important but also scary result, which we can definitely not take lightly. Also, I'm worried that I will be forced to return is followed. Secondly, and the third option, I have a fear of being deported from Lebanon. So these are the results coming in from all of you. Thank you for your participation on that. Like said, let's continue the discussion on these topics and also your questions on the report findings itself in the Q&A that will be now open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pinat, for presenting the data from the Mentimeter. It's interesting to see different kinds of people's perceptions to the same questions. And actually, we have been receiving a few questions on the Q&A option. So please, if you have more questions, feel free to just input those in there and I'll sort of go through them chronologically. However, I do want to begin by noting some of the comments / questions our Syrian colleagues have been asking on the live stream. So I'd like to invite the audience to respond to any of the questions that I'm going to list, and I'm just going to go through them, mainly pointing out sort of the main themes. So they're asking us whether we think, is any political solution in Syria happening? We are also being asked maybe where these people can go to for protection in Lebanon. If anyone does protection service provision, this would be a great time to let us know. We also have a question regarding educational resources. So actually, Basmeh and Zeitooneh does provide educational resources to refugees, so we could potentially be of help with that as well. This is a more general question, maybe for our panelists from our Syrian respondents on YouTube. What are the solutions for Syrian refugees at the present time? What are the solutions for Syrian refugees at the present time? So would anyone like to sort of open the discussion with that question, and then we can move on to the other questions that we have. I think anyone like to interject? You can also speak up in the chat in case you'd rather not sort of turn on your audio. Okay. So I think maybe in my opinion, the solutions for Syrian refugees at the present time is really based on the recommendations that Nadine mentioned earlier. It really is all about, you know, listening to the local community, really involving the local community in activities, in programming, making sure they are at the forefront of anything that we do, you know, organizationally, making sure that they inform us, you know, through our work. This is how sort of we can help build some kind of solution, at least in the medium term. Okay. These are also questions to the panelists in case any of the panelists would like to respond to them. I'm going to go to Marine's question at the beginning. So Marine was asking us, what are the main challenges for Syrians in Lebanon to get accurate and reliable information about the situation in Syria? This was the first part of the question. And the second part is, are there reasons other than their network in Syria being scared of describing the situation over the phone? If any of our panelists have an answer for that, feel free to chime in. Again, the question is about access to accurate and reliable information for Syrians in Lebanon about the situation in Syria.
Hey, Ralph, I can come in on this.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, again, this sort of goes back to what we described in our key findings and in the recommendations. But basically, one of the reasons is, as was outlined in this question, that people are afraid to give accurate information over the phone. I think Syrians are aware that their conversations could be monitored, there could be informants, so they're very careful about that. And then the lack of a proper monitoring mechanism, which is able to basically collect information about what's happening in Syria and different locations and the conditions in those locations, and then relay that information back to displaced persons in Lebanon or in refugee hosting countries. So this is why we're really pushing for a monitoring mechanism.
Would you like to just briefly...
Maybe I can just add on this that, yes, as Nadine mentioned, like the monitoring mechanism would be really important so that we actually know what's going on. But then also I think there needs to be efforts done that information like what we found out through our report, but also there have been many similar reports during the last couple of months from Amnesty, but also from Human Rights Watch, to really make sure that this information actually also is fed back to the people. And I think that's one feature that actually Upinion also really has, that they can actually feed back informations we get back to their panel, which I think is one of these efforts that could be done.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Nadine. Maybe do we want to just briefly explain what the monitoring mechanism is, just since we're mentioning it, so our audience has an idea? Maybe Nadine, if you'd like to chime in really quickly.
Sure. I was wondering if Willem is online to discuss it more, but basically, the monitoring mechanism, there are many forms that it could take, and we explain all about this in the monitoring paper. So in some cases, it's been an initiative that's headed by and completely run by UNHCR, but it takes different forms depending on the context. And what we're currently proponents of or advocating for is a kind of joint monitoring mechanism that would include both local organizations, civil society organizations in Syria, as well as in Lebanon, as well as larger NGOs. And there would be a collaborative effort to ensure that information is being collected from inside Syria and then being shared with local communities, with displaced communities.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Maureen, I hope we've answered your question to the best of our ability. Just going to move on to Tessa's question here in the chat. Tessa is asking us if we can speak more about the current status of the Lebanese return plan. Where does that stand and who is involved and what are the basics of the plan? I might hand it back to you, Nadine. Marielle, also feel free to answer if you have some information about the return plan.
So it's a bit of a complicated question, the return plan. I mean, the draft that we saw of it was from a couple of years ago, and we haven't heard too much about it since then. But basically, it was a plan by the Ministry of Social Affairs to begin returns of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And I mean, it's innocuous on its face, but it doesn't really include enough protections from both UNHCR in terms of reviewing the types of cases of asylum seekers who would be returned, or being local organizations as well, and advocacy groups, and ensuring that there's transparency around the process. And at the moment, we don't see that we have the mechanisms in place to adequately, fairly assess cases of asylum seekers, and we don't trust that this assessment will be done in a proper way according to international standards, such that returns will be done properly, basically. So it will likely result in arbitrary returns, potentially like the situation that we saw in 2019, and that's what we want to avoid.
And who is specifically involved in that plan? Who's the actor? Do we know?
Who's involved? I mean, the GSO, they do mention UNHCR. I'm sorry, I don't have the plan memorized off of my head, but I mean, there is mention of UNHCR, but it's not clear that they will be included at all stages of the process, including from the very beginning of case-by-case assessment. So, but for sure, local organizations were not.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadine. Tess, I also hope we answered your question. And if you have any follow-ups, please feel free to either message our panelists privately or give us another question on the chat or the Q&A function. There is another more general question coming from our Syrian viewers on the live stream. They sort of would like to know if UNHCR is not sort of answering their calls for protection, where else can they go to seek protection, maybe to seek resettlement? If any of our panelists have an answer on that, please feel free to drop it in the chat. At the moment, this is a really main issue sometimes that we struggle with in this field. And so we hope some of our practitioner colleagues can answer this question. So if anyone does do any kind of protection, if anyone does help with resettlement, please feel free to let us know in the chat, and we'll try to address that to the best of our ability. We have another question for the panelists in the open chat this time. How have the dynamics of the pandemic influenced return to Syria? If our panel would like to answer that. I think really quickly, the way the pandemic has shaped return dynamics is just making it much more difficult for people to cross the border on either side, making it much more logistically difficult, bureaucratically difficult, gathering paperwork. And I feel like it just makes it much more materially difficult to cross back and forth. I'm not sure if any of our colleagues can speak to the border still being closed or opening between Syria and Lebanon, but that also has posed quite an obstacle in the past, the closure of the border between Syria and Lebanon. And so crossing into Lebanon or crossing into Syria has posed quite the issue. Let me go through your questions really quickly. Unfortunately, our panelists are answering that with regards to resettlement, UNHCR is the only main body that can handle resettlement. All resettlement goes through UNHCR. However, there are organizations that could be of help to individuals who might want to consider resettling and might need some help. For example, IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project, does help people resettle through the UNHCR that I know of. NGOs unfortunately don't have any power or capacity to support on resettlement. However, there are, for example, a lot of private sponsorship schemes in host countries that do sort of help refugees resettle with their help them with their papers and cover their costs. So that might be worth looking into, you know, the private sponsorship schemes that exist in various host countries. There's another question being asked from the panel on the live stream, which I think some of our panelists here could be able to answer. They're asking why UNHCR pays them in Lebanese pounds as opposed to in US dollars if they get their funding in US dollars. This is an interesting question to answer, maybe.
I think it's hard to say without having someone from UNHCR enlighten on this. What I'm aware of is that many international organizations, even if they do receive funding in dollars, it's then being converted to liras at some kind of rate that was agreed upon between these organizations and the government. I'm not sure if this is the case for UNHCR, so I can't speak that with any certainty, but this could be one of the reasons why. And this is why we're also advocating that funds be received in Lebanon in the same currency that they're being sent in, so that, as we mentioned during the recommendations, these funds can be maximized on and relief efforts can spread a lot wider.
Yeah, I'd also like to add to that. Actually, I can't speak for UNHCR, but through our advocacy meetings with different states that different countries that actually fund UNHCR, we've discussed dollarization of aid, and the answer has been as much as we think aid should be dollarized, they're also considering the kind of sensitivities that would arise from that between the host community and refugee communities. So I know that this conversation of dollarization of aid is on the table and being discussed with UNHCR, but I guess they're trying to figure out a way that would be convenient for everyone.
Yes, thank you, Maria and Nadine. These are really difficult questions. Sometimes even, you know, us working in the field, sometimes you don't really have a clear view of why things happen in the way they do happen. But what we will try to do is we'll try to sort of answer to the best of our ability and guide people to the correct resources that they might need at the moment. So there is one last question from Yusuf. Yusuf is asking our panel about the people between the border of Belarus and Poland. He says, because I think this is proof enough that it is not safe to stay in Syria. People decide to take this trip even though they know it is very dangerous. And now people are used in a political game and every day people die there at that border. if any of our panelists would like to sort of chime in on that.
Hi, Yusuf. Thank you very much for the question. I'm Rosie Ball, the EU Advocacy Advisor at PAX. Yeah, in response to your question, I think it really highlights the desperate situation that people are in, that they're willing to take that journey, even knowing that it's so dangerous. And I think that as a coalition, specifically on the Belarus-Poland situation at the moment, we'd urge for there to not be a kind of passing of responsibility between Belarus and Poland. They're both violating their international obligations, and the priority of the international community should be to provide protection for those people who are stuck there. But yeah, I think your question really highlights how desperate the situation is for many people who are really trying to seek real and meaningful protection.
Thank you, Yusuf, for that question. And again, if you have any follow-ups, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're almost at time. So I would urge anyone who has any more questions, please to feel free to speak up at the moment. If not, I will say that this event has been recorded, and we will be sending the recording as well as the presentation with some contacts of the panelists over email. We also urge people to view the presentation and the recording of this presentation on our website, found right here on the slide in front of you, www.refugee-protectionwatch.org. And all the materials will be found on the website in the coming days. Okay, if no one has any other questions, we would like to thank our audience for being such a great audience. Thank you for asking really good questions. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your time with us. And we would also like to thank our colleagues, our Syrian colleagues, anyone watching from Lebanon. تحية كتير كبيرة، شكرا كتير لحضوركم معنا. We would like to say that, they have been telling us throughout this event that they cannot return. Syria is not safe. Return is not an option for them at the moment. So this is, the real reality on the ground for people at the moment. And these questions that we got are just some of the questions that we grapple with every day as practitioners as well. It would be great if going forward, maybe some of our audience members could feel free to email us, share some of the resources they think would be useful that we can then share with our panel of Syrian respondents watching the live stream. Because at the end, they are the community that we are here to serve. So again, we thank you very much, everyone watching from Lebanon, and everyone who has joined with us today. Again, a huge thank you. And we will be in touch very soon with the report and all the materials.